Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to talk about the development of counterculture within the United States in reaction to a combination of the failure of civil rights, political disenchantment of Americans with the Vietnam War, and, young people's pushback against rising consumerism and the values of their parents. So, here's our objectives for today. Take a moment to take them in, and we'll continue to move forward. The Vietnam War and the civil rights movement led to some sharp cultural divides. I mean, especially the divide over Vietnam flipping really in early 1968 with the Tet Offensive, as more and more Americans began to believe that maybe the war was a mistake and maybe our country should not have been involved in this. This is going to lead to, amongst young people, the creation of this counterculture that's kind of an offshoot of the anti-war movement, kind of an offshoot of the civil rights movement, but it's really different from both of those. It's a real movement of young people to withdraw from society. The beginning of this is often tied to the Human Be-In, which is a gathering of sort of countercultural people within San Francisco in 1967 that really leads into the quote unquote summer of love, which many consider the beginning of the hippie movement. These young people are showing up in San Francisco to hang out, be people, create music, create art, have sex, do psychedelic drugs, and just kind of escape from most of modern society. And so this summer of love really leads to the creation of this identity of the hippie. And you see a lot of important countercultural forces here. And then at the end of the Summer of Love, many of these young people sort of go back to their lives and go back to their lives, go back to their jobs, go back to their studies, and return to life, moving out of this sort of dream that the summer of '67 was for a lot of people. Woodstock is the other sort of this other sort of cultural apex of the movement. It was a music festival that was supposed to happen in this town in sort of upstate New York, but as it grew in popularity, the town was very concerned about all these countercultural and hippie forces descending, and so they tried to cancel it at the last minute. A local farmer allowed it to be held in his fields, which were flooded from recent spring rains, and it became this sort of this sort of muddy drug. In this sort of muddy and drug filled musical festival that really became, again, the sort of peak of the hippie movement and something that a lot of music promoters have been trying to create ever since with very, very limited success. So here's Woodstock, again, sort of the height of this hippie countercultural movement. Probably the most famous moment here is Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner. So if you've never seen that, you definitely should. And we'll move on. Drug use becomes an important part of this hippie movement as well, specifically the use of LSD and other psychedelic drugs. Timothy Leary was a former Harvard psychology professor who became kind of the evangelist for this movement with his slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," encouraging young people to expand their minds with psychedelics. And the Merry Pranksters were a group who traveled around the country in their psychedelic bus, dosing people with acid and inviting them to travel around with them and have experiences. And so this becomes sort of an indelible part of this countercultural movement. The Nixon administration was very, very, very wary about this, starting up the war on drugs and the DEA, Nixon famously labeling drug use as public enemy number one. So you should definitely read Nixon's speech or listen to Nixon's speech on the drug problem. And the Nixon administration, of course, not being totally altruistic, also used this to target their political enemies, specifically anti-war protesters and the leaders of sort of more radical civil rights groups. So take a moment, pause, read this, and let's move on. Other groups that were not necessarily part of the counterculture but grew out of this period of change are the National Organization for Women. This is a national civil rights group created in 1966 whose goal was to break down the structural barriers that prevented women from living equal lives with men. The sort of manifesto of this group became Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, raising awareness that there were a significant amount of American women who were not happy with the sort of nuclear family status quo that had become synonymous with the 1950s. We see people like Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm pushing to break down barriers, Gloria Steinem pushing to break professional barriers, Shirley Chisholm knocking down glass ceilings as far as political barriers go. And we see pushes for women to get equal access to extracurriculars, to sports, to educational offerings, specifically with the writing of Title IX, which prevented people from excluding women or people on the basis of sex for educational programs or activities. So Title IX is going to open up massive opportunities for women in education, in sports, in clubs, in things like that. And the women's rights movement also pushed for the creation of an Equal Rights Amendment, which would be sort of like the 14th Amendment, except ban discrimination based on gender. It passed both houses of Congress. Here's Gloria Steinem arguing why an Equal Rights Amendment is important. So take a moment, pause, and read. But there was also a significant pushback against the ERA, arguing that there were significant differences between men and women, and that men and women needed somewhat separate treatment because of the differences in their gender. Phyllis Schlafly was one of the key opponents to the ERA, and here she is arguing why she opposes the ERA. And so we'll come back and check in on the ERA as it attempts to be ratified by 2/3 of the states, which is, of course, necessary for it to become law in the United States. So take a moment, pause, read, and let's move forward. Roe v. Wade was another key moment in this movement. Access to abortion rights was something that certain women's rights groups had been pushing, arguing that abortion is necessary for women to be able to control their bodies, and that abortions were happening anyway, and that having access to safe and legal abortion is incredibly important for women's health. The Supreme Court agreed and established under the right to privacy that women had a right to an abortion under some circumstances nationwide. This struck down abortion restrictions in a lot of states and also galvanized an anti-abortion movement that's going to become a really important part of the Republican coalition going forward. And so Roe v. Wade is definitely something that we'll continue talking about moving forward. For Hispanic people, the United Farm Workers Union was very important in attempting to secure rights for migrant workers, and it morphed into a larger Hispanic civil rights movement. Cesar Chavez is one of the most important leaders of the movement, although Dolores Huerta was also very important. So this is going to push for greater protections for farm workers and general awareness for issues that are important for Hispanic Americans. The American Indian movement attempted to highlight issues that were important to Native Americans. The American Indian movement was one of a number of Native American civil rights movements, and specifically AIM here did a number of high-profile sort of stunts, famously taking control of Alcatraz Island and mailing the which, as you hopefully know, was the former site of a prison in San Francisco Bay. The activists then mailed the federal government some beads in order to pay for the island, famously attempting to echo the sort of purchase of Manhattan Island from Native Americans by Dutch people, 300 years prior to this. And Nixon is going to attempt to provide greater civil rights for Native Americans, giving increasing money to Native American groups in order to attempt to both alleviate poverty on reservations and to help preserve Native American culture, language, heritage, things like that. So take a moment, read Nixon's special message on Indian policy, and let's move forward. The American Indian movement sort of fell off after splits within the movement, much like other civil rights movements. Famously, American Indian movement activists seized control of Wounded Knee, a town in South Dakota, which was the famous site of the massacre of Sitting Bull and his followers during the Ghost Dance movement. There was a standoff over the federal government, and in the end, 2 people were killed and 13 people were wounded as the activists were eventually driven out of Wounded Knee. This ended up leading to a falling away of support and splits within the movement, and that's really the end of progress for Native Americans. The Stonewall Riot, quote unquote, led to the rise in the gay rights movement. The Stonewall Inn was a bar and sort of a dance area that was favored by LGBTQ individuals in New York City. It was raided by police who were attempting to shut it down for, violating various laws that were still on the books in New York. and the confrontation between police officers and the patrons at the Stonewall, which you should definitely take a moment and pause and read. This was a galvanizing movement, a moment for the gay rights movement, leading to a variety of different gay pride and gay rights organizations and a greater public awareness of the issues that that LGBTQ people were dealing with, and attempts to get greater public acceptance. So this is the beginning of a civil rights movement for gay people as well. We also saw a rise in environmentalism. We also saw a rise to environmentalism of the environmental movement during this time, especially with the book Silent Spring. Silent Spring was a book about the effect of pesticides, specifically on bird and eagle populations. The drug DDT was a popular pesticide that had filtered into the water system and led to the almost extinction of the bald eagle in the United States. So Silent Spring led to greater awareness of this, the banning of DDT, and the rehabilitation of our national symbol. And the fires on the Cayuga River eventually led the Nixon administration to start taking action on this. Industrial runoff in Cleveland led the Cayuga River to catch fire multiple times, highlighting the fact that maybe we need to treat our water better because, waters really shouldn't be catching fire. So, yeah, that's an issue. So Nixon here is going to create the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which is going to oversee a lot of these sort of environmental causes. And similarly to the DEA, coordinated the response to the drug problem, the EPA is going to coordinate federal response to environmentalism. Finally, the Supreme Court during this time period is going to have a number of different cases providing rights to accused people, including Miranda rights, the rights to a lawyer, the rights to not having evidence that's seized illegally used against you, things like that. And so we see significant increases in civil rights for people accused of crimes. And so that's also going to happen during this time period. So apologies, that was kind of a laundry list of things that we needed to get out of the way that didn't totally fit into the narrative. So next time, we'll pick up our narrative in 68 with Nixon trying to deal with the Vietnam War and talk more in depth about the Nixon administration's foreign policy and its economic policy. So for now, thank you for listening.